Ruth Calloway didn't believe in coincidences. She believed in work, in silence, and in God, in that order. But that night, on the muddy road between Gloucester and the harbor, something she couldn't name made her tighten the reins and press her feet to the ground. The rain had been falling since midday. Not the polite kind of rain that washes the air clean and moves on, the stubborn, punishing kind that soaks through wool and wood and bone, and makes a person wonder what they ever did to deserve it. The road to the harbor was barely a road at all anymore. It was a river of mud, carved by wagon wheels and horse hooves, swallowing everything that dared to cross it after dark. Ruth had dared. She had no choice. The supply run to Gloucester couldn't wait. The merchant who carried her dried fish and salt pork wouldn't hold the order past sundown, and an order like that was the difference between a full month and an empty one. So she'd gone, Eliza bundled in the back of the cart beneath 2 wool blankets and a prayer, and she'd made the trade and started back before the worst of the storm rolled in from the Atlantic. She hadn't made it in time. The lantern hanging from the cart post swung violently in the wind, throwing wild shadows across the tree line. The pines on both sides of the road groaned and bent. Ruth kept her eyes forward, her jaw set, one hand on the reins and one steadying the lantern's hook. She knew this road. She'd traveled it 100 times. She knew every root and stone and bend in it. Or she thought she did. She didn't know the man. He was just a shape at first. A dark mass in the middle of the road that her horse Chester refused to approach. Chester planted his hooves and snorted, tossing his head, and Ruth had to pull hard on the reins to keep him from veering entirely into the tree line. "Easy," she said. To the horse or to herself, she wasn't sure. She lifted the lantern and leaned forward on the bench. The shape became a man, a very large man, face down in the mud, arms spread wide. His coat, long black soaked through, spread around him like spilled ink. A tricorn hat sat upside down in a puddle 6 inches from his head, already half full of rainwater. And there, still gripped in his right fist, was a cutlass. Broad-bladed, dark with age and use, its edge catching the lantern light in a thin, dangerous line. Ruth sat very still. Behind her, she heard the rustle of blankets. "Mama." Eliza's voice was small and precise, the way it always was when she was frightened but trying not to show it. "Is he dead?" Ruth didn't answer. She watched the man's back, watched for movement, for the rise and fall that would tell her whether she was looking at a problem or a corpse. There, barely, but there. A breath. His back rose a fraction of an inch and fell again. "He's alive," Ruth said. "Oh," said Eliza, and then after a pause, "That's worse, isn't it?" It was. Ruth knew it the moment her daughter said it. A dead man in the road was a terrible thing, but a dead man asked nothing of you. A living man, especially one this size, dressed like that, carrying that, was a different matter entirely. She should have gone around. Chester could manage the tree line for 30 feet, enough to clear the body and get back on the road. No one would have blamed her. A widow, alone, with a child, no jury in Massachusetts would have convicted her of common sense. But Eliza had already slipped out from under the blankets. Ruth heard the soft thud of small boots hitting the mud before she could say a word. "Eliza." "He's bleeding, Mama." The girl crouched down beside the man without a trace of hesitation, the way children do when their instinct for compassion hasn't yet been tempered by fear. She held her little lantern, a toy really, with a stub of candle inside, close to the man's face. "There's a lot of blood. Here, on his side." Ruth climbed down from the cart. The mud swallowed her boots to the ankle. The rain hit her face like cold needles. She walked to where Eliza crouched and looked down at the man and felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on her chest like a stone. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere past 40, maybe deep into it. His beard was a dark tangle shot through with gray, matted with rain and what was undeniably blood. The scar on his face, she could see it clearly now, a pale ridge running from his ear to the corner of his mouth, was old, long healed. But there was a newer wound, somewhere beneath the coat, seeping dark through the fabric on his left side. His hand still hadn't released the cutlass. "He's a pirate," Eliza said, with something that was almost awe. "We don't know that." "He has a pirate hat, Mama." Ruth couldn't argue with that. She crouched down and pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck. His pulse was there, slow, thick, unsteady, but there. His skin was cold, not the cold of a healthy man caught in the rain, the cold of a body that had been losing something vital for too long. "We can't leave him," Eliza said. "We don't know who he is. We know he's bleeding." Ruth looked at her daughter. 7 years old, hair plastered to her face, boots sinking in the mud, holding a toy lantern over a stranger with a sword, and completely certain about what needed to be done. Ruth had no idea where the child got that kind of certainty. Not from her. Ruth had spent most of the last 5 years being certain of almost nothing. She stood up, looked at the road ahead, looked at Chester, who was watching her with dark, patient eyes, as if to say, "You already know what you're going to do." "Get back in the cart," she told Eliza. "Are we leaving him?" "No, get in the cart." She bent down and took the cutlass from the man's hand. He didn't resist. She carried it to the cart and put it under the bench, beneath a folded piece of canvas where Eliza couldn't reach it. Then she went back, grabbed the man under his arms, and began the slow, brutal work of dragging 200 pounds of unconscious pirate out of the mud. It took her nearly 10 minutes. By the end of it, her back was screaming and her hands were bleeding from a splinter she'd caught on his coat buckle. But she got him up and into the back of the cart, rolled onto his back, his head lolling to one side, his boots hanging off the edge. She covered him with the spare canvas. It wasn't much, but it was something. She climbed back to the bench, took up the reins. Chester still hadn't moved. "Good boy," she said. "Let's go." The horse started forward without further argument. From the back of the cart, Eliza's voice drifted up through the rain. "Mama?" "Yes." "He said something." Ruth's hands tightened on the reins. "What did he say?" A pause. The rain. The creak of the wheels. "He said, don't let them find it." Ruth stared at the road ahead, the dark line of the trees, the distant, invisible sound of the harbor somewhere beyond them, where the sea was doing whatever the sea did on a night like this, heaving and grinding and keeping its secrets. Don't let them find it. She didn't ask what it was. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But she understood, with a clarity that settled into her chest like a coal going cold, that the moment she'd put that man in her cart, her life had divided into 2 parts, everything before this road and everything after it. She just didn't know yet which part would be harder to survive. The rain had stopped before dawn, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm. Ruth hadn't slept. She'd sat in the chair beside the fireplace, the cutlass tucked under the bench 2 steps away, listening to the uneven breathing of the stranger on her floor, and asking herself what kind of woman she had become. Not the kind her mother had raised, certainly. Her mother had raised a woman who latched her door at night and kept her eyes forward on the road and never, under any circumstances, brought strange men home. Her mother had raised a woman who understood that the world was full of dangers that didn't announce themselves, that trouble rarely knocked before entering, and the only protection a woman alone had was the quality of her judgment. Ruth had left that judgment somewhere in the mud last night, apparently. The man, Duncan, she'd found the name stitched inside the collar of his coat, rough letters in faded thread, the way sailors marked their things, had not woken during the night. She'd cleaned the wound on his side as best she could, a deep gash, long and jagged, the kind made by a blade rather than a fall. Someone had cut him. Someone had cut him and left him for dead on the Gloucester Road, and Ruth had been foolish enough to carry him home. She'd packed the wound with clean linen and bound it tight. His fever had climbed through the small hours and broken somewhere around 3 in the morning, leaving him drenched in sweat but breathing easier. She'd changed the linen twice. She'd boiled water and pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and told herself she was doing it for Eliza. Because Eliza would have been devastated to wake and find the man dead on her floor. And not because there was something in his face, in the deep exhaustion carved into every line of it, that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. The fire had burned low. Ruth added 2 more logs and sat back down. Outside, the first gray light of morning began to press through the oiled paper windows. And then Duncan Mercer opened his eyes. He didn't move. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men, waking in a strange place, would have lurched upright, grabbed for a weapon, demanded answers. Duncan opened his eyes. Pale gray, she saw now, the color of harbor water on a cloudy day, and lay perfectly still, scanning the ceiling, the walls, the fire, and then, finally, her. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. "You're in my house," Ruth said. She kept her voice even. "You were on the road last night. You were injured and unconscious. I brought you in out of the rain." He said nothing. His eyes moved from her face to the room around them, taking inventory, she realized. Calculating. Even half dead, the man was calculating. "Your sword is under the bench," she added. "I didn't touch it past moving it. It's still there." Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, exactly. More like the careful recalibration of a man reassessing a situation he'd expected to be worse. "How bad?" he said. His voice was deep and rough, scraped raw by fever or drink or years of salt air. "Probably all 3. "The wound? Bad enough. You lost a great deal of blood. You'll need to rest for—" "How long was I out?" "Since I found you. 8 hours, perhaps 9. He closed his eyes. Something crossed his face. Pain, or the ghost of a decision being made. "I need to leave," he said. "You need to lie still before you tear that wound open and bleed out on my floor." He looked at her again. There was something almost like surprise in it, as if he wasn't accustomed to being spoken to plainly. Then his gaze shifted past her shoulder, and Ruth turned to find Eliza standing in the doorway to the back room, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her dark eyes wide and completely unafraid. "You're awake," Eliza said, with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction had been confirmed. Duncan Mercer stared at the child for a long moment. Something moved behind his gray eyes. Something Ruth couldn't read. Something that was there and then gone, sealed behind whatever wall the man used to keep the world out. "The girl?" he said. "She was in the cart." "My daughter," Ruth said. "Eliza." He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. "I'm Eliza Calloway," the girl said, advancing into the room with the confidence of someone who had decided this man was not a threat. "My mother's name is Ruth." "What's yours?" Ruth opened her mouth to tell Eliza that was enough, but the man answered first. "Duncan," he said. "Duncan what?" A pause. "Just Duncan." Eliza considered this with great seriousness, then nodded as if it were a perfectly acceptable answer. She went to the fireplace and sat down cross-legged in front of it, pulling her blanket tight, and began studying the man with the frank, unhurried attention that only children and cats possess. Ruth stood up. "I'll get water. And bread, if you can manage it." She went to the kitchen and gripped the edge of the work table and breathed. In the small, ordinary act of filling a cup from the pitcher and cutting 2 slices from the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago, she tried to find her footing, to remember what was real and what was manageable. What was real? There was a wounded stranger in her front room. He had been cut by someone. He had said in his sleep, "Don't let them find it." He was already talking about leaving, which meant he was afraid of something, or someone, and that something or someone might eventually come looking. What was manageable? She did not yet know. She brought him the bread and water. He ate slowly, carefully, like a man relearning the mechanics of his own body. He drank all the water without being asked and didn't thank her for refilling the cup. "Who cut you?" she asked when he'd finished. He looked at her steadily. "Men I owe a debt to." "A debt you can't pay?" "A debt they'd rather collect in blood." Ruth sat down in her chair. Outside, the morning was brightening, thin and cold, the kind of November light that promises nothing. She could hear the harbor from here, the distant cry of gulls, the knock of boats against their moorings, the world going about its business, indifferent to whatever had happened on the road to Gloucester. "You said something," she said. "Last night. when you were barely conscious. You said don't let them find it. The stillness that came over him was absolute. The bread in his hand, the cup on the floor beside him, the faint crackle of the fire. Everything else continued, but Duncan Mercer went completely, unnervingly still. I don't remember saying that, he said. I know you don't, but you said it. He looked at the fire. The scar along his jaw caught the light, that long pale ridge that marked him as a man who had survived something most men hadn't. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You should put me back on the road, he said. You and the girl. You should put me out and bolt your door and forget you ever saw me. My daughter already knows your name, Ruth said. It's a little late for that. The ghost of something, it might have been a smile or the memory of one, crossed his face and vanished. Then I'm sorry for it, he said quietly. Ruth studied him. This man with his sea-gray eyes and his sealed-off silences and his wound that someone had given him deliberately. This man who had been left for dead on a night road and was already thinking about leaving before his blood had dried. What is it? She asked. What don't you want them to find? He said nothing. If it's in my house, Ruth said, her voice very steady. I have a right to know. Duncan Mercer turned his head and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't since he'd opened his eyes, as if he were measuring something, calculating some risk she couldn't see. It's not in your house, he said. Then where is it? A long pause. The fire, the gulls, Eliza's quiet breathing. At the bottom of the harbor, he said. And if the wrong men find it before I do? He stopped, looked back at the ceiling. It won't just be me they come after. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Ruth didn't move, didn't speak. She sat with the cold spreading through her chest and the sound of her daughter humming softly to herself by the fire, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that whatever was at the bottom of that harbor had just become her problem too. Ruth was feeding the horse when she saw them. 2 men on horseback coming down the village road toward her property, slowly, too slowly for travelers, too straight-backed for merchants. She recognized the quality of that slowness. It was the pace of men who already knew where they were going and wanted everyone to see that they weren't in a hurry, because men who weren't in a hurry were men who had nothing to fear. She set the bucket down, walked back to the house without running, because running would be the same as confirming what they already suspected. Inside, Duncan was on his feet. He was standing at the oiled paper window, one hand braced against the wall, his weight shifted off his left side where the wound was. He'd heard them too, or sensed them, the way a man who had spent his life being hunted developed a sense for it that went beyond hearing. How many? He said without turning. 2, on horseback. Harwick's men. Not a question. You know them? I know the way they ride. He turned from the window. His face was composed, not calm exactly, but arranged into something that looked like calm, the way a ship's hull looks solid until you see the water coming through. Where's the girl? Back room. Asleep. Ruth crossed to the bench and pulled out the cutlass. She held it out to him. Take it. He looked at the blade, then at her. You know how to use one of those? No. That's why I'm giving it to you. Something moved in his gray eyes. He took the cutlass. The moment it was in his hand, something shifted in his posture, a subtle, dangerous realignment, like a key turning in a lock. Listen to me, he said. His voice was low and very steady. Whatever they say, whatever they tell you, don't deny having seen me. They'll know you're lying. Just say I came to the door last night asking for shelter. You gave me bread and water and sent me on my way. And if they don't believe that, then we'll know before it gets worse. He moved toward the back of the house, favoring his left side. Is there a back way out? Through the kitchen, the door opens onto the woodlot. He nodded, paused at the kitchen doorway. Ruth. It was the first time he'd used her name. Something about the way he said it, without ornamentation, without the careful distance he'd maintained since waking, made her breath catch. "Keep the girl quiet," he said. "Whatever happens." Then he was through the kitchen and gone. The knock came 3 minutes later. 3 hard strikes against the door. Not the knock of a visitor, the knock of a man who expected the door to open immediately and had opinions about what would happen if it didn't. Ruth smoothed her skirt, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and opened it. The man on her doorstep was tall and narrow, dressed in a dark coat that had once been expensive and was now just old. He had a long face, thin lips, and eyes the color of weak tea, pale and flat and evaluating everything at once. Behind him, still on horseback at the edge of her yard, the second man sat watching with his hand resting on something at his hip. "Mrs. Calloway?" the tall man said. "Yes." "My name is Silas Horn. I work for Mr. Harwick, Edmund Harwick of the Harwick Trading Company. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions." His voice was polite. The politeness of it was the most frightening thing about him. "About what?" Ruth said. "About a man who may have passed this way last night. Large fellow, dark coat, injured possibly." He paused. "Armed." Ruth looked at him with the expression she'd spent years perfecting. The expression of a widow who had enough problems of her own and very little patience for anyone who wanted to add to them. "There was a man," she said. "Came to my door in the rain, looked rough. I gave him bread and sent him on." Horn's pale eyes didn't move from her face. "What time was this?" "Late, after dark, 9 o'clock perhaps." "And he went which way?" Ruth pointed south, away from the harbor, away from the woodlot. "Down the road toward Rockport." Horn was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a thin, careful smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "do you live alone here?" "With my daughter." "No other family? No men on the property?" "None." He nodded slowly. His gaze moved past her shoulder, into the house, taking in the room behind her. Ruth didn't move, didn't look back. She held the door at its current width and kept her face still, and thought about Eliza in the back room and prayed with a ferocity she hadn't felt since the night her husband didn't come home from the sea. "You understand," Horn said pleasantly, "that the man you described has stolen something of considerable value from Mr. Harwick. Something that belongs to him. We're simply trying to recover what's his." "I understand," Ruth said. "I hope you find it." Another pause. Horn's eyes moved to her hands, both visible, both still, then back to her face. "If he comes back," Horn said, "or if you remember anything else, anything at all, Mr. Harwick would be very grateful. Very grateful indeed." He reached into his coat and produced a small coin purse, held it out. Ruth looked at the purse, looked at Horn. "I'll remember that," she said, and did not take the money. Something shifted in Horn's expression. The smile stayed, but what was behind it changed. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway," he said. He turned and walked back to his horse. The second man, broader, with a red beard and eyes that had been fixed on Ruth the entire time, said something quietly to Horn as he mounted. Horn replied without looking back at the house. Then both men rode south, the way Ruth had pointed. She stood in the doorway and watched them go. She waited until they were out of sight around the bend. Then she shut the door and stood with her back against it and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. "Mama." She opened her eyes. Eliza was standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her dark hair loose, her face very serious. "I heard," the girl said quietly. "I know. You lied to them." "Yes." Eliza considered this for a moment with the grave, unblinking attention she gave to things that mattered. Was that the right thing to do? Ruth looked at her daughter, at the small face that trusted her completely, always without condition. A trust Ruth had done everything in her power for 7 years to deserve. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. She found Duncan in the wood lot, crouched behind the stack of split pine with the cutlass across his knees. He was pale and sweating. The walk and the tension had cost him, and the wound was seeping again. a dark stain spreading through the fresh linen. "They're gone," she said. He stood slowly, one hand pressed to his side. "South?" "I pointed them south." He looked at her. Something in his expression she couldn't fully name. Something that was gratitude and guilt pressed together into a shape that didn't have a word. "They'll figure it out," he said. "Horn is not a stupid man. They'll be back before nightfall." "I know. Ruth, tell me what's in the harbor." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "No more pieces. All of it. Right now." Duncan Mercer stood in the cold morning light among the stacked pine and the smell of wood sap, and looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered himself onto the chopping block and set the cutlass across his knees and began to talk. The story came out slowly at first, then faster, the way confessions do once they start. He had served Harwick for 11 years, not as a sailor, as an enforcer, a collector. A man who crossed the lines that respectable merchants needed crossed and kept his mouth shut about it afterward. He had done things he wasn't proud of. He said this without self-pity, as a plain statement of fact. 3 months ago, Harwick had ordered something that Duncan wouldn't do. He didn't say what it was. His jaw tightened when he reached that part, and Ruth didn't push. But she understood from the way his hands went still on the cutlass that whatever it was had involved someone who couldn't defend themselves. He'd taken the evidence instead. Documents, a ledger, proof of everything Harwick had done over 11 years. The smuggling, the bribes, the names of the judges he owned and the customs officials he paid. He'd wrapped it in oilcloth and sealed it in a brass case and dropped it in 12 feet of water off the North Pier, weighted with chain. Then he'd tried to get to Boston, to the one magistrate in Massachusetts he believed Harwick hadn't bought. He hadn't made it past Gloucester. "The ledger," Ruth said. "That's what he wants back. Without it, there's no proof. With it—" Duncan paused. "With it, Harwick hangs, and everyone he owns knows it. That's why Horn won't stop." Ruth sat down on the woodpile across from him. The cold seeped through her skirt. Above them, the bare branches of the oaks moved in the November wind, and somewhere beyond the trees the harbor was there, gray and cold and holding its secret 12 feet down. "You can't swim," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen his side. "Not today. And Horn comes back tonight." "Yes." Ruth looked at her hands, the same hands that had dragged him out of the mud. The same hands that had cleaned his wound and held the door against Horn's pale eyes and pointed south on a lie that would buy them maybe 6 hours. "I know the North Pier," she said quietly. "I've fished off it since I was Eliza's age." Duncan went very still. "I know where 12 feet is," she continued. "My husband used to mark the depths with the anchor line." She looked up. "I can find it. Ruth." His voice was rough. "I am not asking you to." "I know you're not." She stood up. "I'm telling you." The wind moved through the oaks. A gull cried somewhere over the harbor, high and distant. Duncan Mercer looked at this woman, this widow with her calloused hands and her stubborn jaw, and her daughter who hadn't flinched at a pirate bleeding on her floor. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely nothing to say. "Get back inside," Ruth said. "Rest that wound, and don't argue with me." She walked back toward the house without waiting for his answer. Behind her, she heard him get up from the chopping block, heard his slow, careful steps following her through the woodlot. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, given everything, that the most dangerous thing about Duncan Mercer was not the cutlass, or the men chasing him, or the secret at the bottom of the harbor. It was the way she was starting to trust him, and she couldn't afford that. Not yet. Not until this was over. Ruth entered the harbor at 2 in the afternoon. The water was so cold it knocked the breath out of her on the first stroke. A cold that wasn't just temperature, it was warning. The kind of cold that tells a body exactly how serious it is about killing you if you give it the chance. The November harbor smelled of salt and brine and the rot of old rope, and beneath her, 12 feet down, the bottom was dark and invisible from the surface. But Ruth knew this harbor. She had fished off the North Pier since she was younger than Eliza. She had watched her father mark the depths with a knotted anchor line, counting off the fathoms in a low voice like a prayer. She had sat on these planks in summer heat and winter cold and every kind of weather in between, and she knew where the bottom shelved and where it dropped and where, off the third piling from the end, the depth was exactly right. She dove. The cold closed over her head like a fist. She kept her eyes open despite the sting and pulled herself down hand over hand along the piling, the barnacles cutting her palms, the light above her shrinking to a gray shimmer. Her lungs began their complaint almost immediately. She hadn't had time to rest, hadn't had time to prepare, had barely had time to change into the old dress she kept for washing that she didn't mind ruining. Her fingers touched the bottom. Sand, mud, the smooth curve of a rock. She swept her hands in wide arcs, moving blind, her hair floating up around her face, the cold settling into her bones with a patience that frightened her. Nothing. Her lungs screamed. She pushed back up. She broke the surface, gasping, grabbed the piling, pressed her forehead against the barnacled wood and breathed. On the pier above her she could hear Eliza's feet, the careful, deliberate steps of a child who had been told to stay back and was staying back, but only just. "Mama?" "I'm here," Ruth managed. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine. Her hands were bleeding and her lips were going numb and she had found nothing. But she had also only searched half of the area. She filled her lungs, thought of Horn's pale eyes and his careful smile and what he'd do when he came back and found Duncan still there. She dove again. This time she went deeper, farther from the piling, sweeping the bottom in the opposite direction. The cold was worse on the second dive. Her body had lost the thin buffer the first shock had provided, and now the water went straight to her core. She could feel her fingers losing precision, the fine motor control going first the way it always did. Her knuckles hit something hard. Not rock, metal. She grabbed it, heavy, heavier than she'd expected, weighted with chain the way Duncan had said. She pulled. It didn't move. She braced her feet against the bottom and pulled again with everything she had and felt the chain shift, drag, and then give. Not free, but enough. She got both hands under it and pushed off the bottom with her legs and began the long, burning climb back to the surface. She nearly didn't make it. The weight was immense and her lungs were passed, screaming into something quieter and more serious. And for one terrible moment, suspended between the bottom and the surface, neither world willing to claim her, Ruth thought with absolute clarity, "This is how it ends." Then Eliza's hands were in the water above her. Small hands, reaching down from the pier, grabbing her wrist with a grip that had no business being as strong as it was. It wasn't enough to pull her up. But it was enough to pull her forward. Ruth broke the surface, gasped, grabbed the pier edge. Hung there, unable to move for a full minute, the brass case pressed against her chest, the chain dragging in the water below her. "I've got you," Eliza said, kneeling at the pier edge, both hands locked around her mother's wrist. Her voice was completely steady. "I've got you, Mama. Don't let go." Ruth didn't let go. Duncan was at the woodlot when she came back. He had heard them coming, some instinct, some vibration in the air, and had made it outside before Ruth reached the house. He met her at the tree line, took the brass case from her hands without a word, and stood very still for a moment with it pressed against his chest the way she had held it in the water. Then he looked at her, soaked through, shaking, her palms wrapped in strips torn from the ruined dress. And something in his face broke open in a way she suspected it hadn't in a very long time. "You found it," he said. "Obviously," said Eliza, from behind Ruth's left shoulder. Despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the sound of horses she could already hear on the road, Ruth laughed. It came out ragged and a little wild, but it was real. "We need to go," Duncan said. "Now." "They're closer than I thought." They left in the cart. Duncan drove, which Ruth allowed because her hands were in no condition to manage the reins, and because Chester, inexplicably, had taken to him in the way horses sometimes take to people who have spent their lives around them. Eliza sat between them on the bench, wrapped in every blanket they'd had time to grab, the brass case on her lap because she had simply picked it up and held it, and neither adult had thought to argue. They took the inland road, the long way, the slow way, the way that added 2 hours to the journey, but avoided the Gloucester road entirely. The November light was dying fast, pulling the color out of the trees and the fields and the sky until everything was the same shade of cold gray. Horn and his man would reach the house within the hour. They would find it empty. They would understand what had happened, and they would go to Harwick, and Harwick would make decisions. But by then, if everything held, they would be past Salem, and by morning, Boston. "Will it be enough?" Ruth asked. "The ledger, will it be enough to stop him?" Duncan's eyes stayed on the road. "It's 11 years of everything. Harwick trusted no one. He kept his own records, in his own hand. Every name, every amount, every judge." A pause. "It'll be enough. And the magistrate in Boston, you trust him." "I trust that he hates Harwick more than Harwick has been able to pay for." He glanced at her. "It's not a perfect foundation, but it's a real one." Ruth considered this. The cart rocked and creaked along the inland road. An owl called somewhere in the darkening trees. "What happens after?" she asked. Duncan was quiet for a moment. "After Harwick is finished, Horn has nothing to enforce. The men scatter. It's over. I meant for you." The question sat in the air between them. Eliza, with the particular sensitivity of children who understand more than adults give them credit for, said nothing and looked very carefully at the trees. "I don't know," Duncan said. It came out honest, unguarded, without the careful arrangement she'd grown accustomed to. "I've been running toward this for 3 months. I haven't thought past it." "You could stay," Eliza said, still looking at the trees. "In Gloucester. There's a spare room." "Eliza," Ruth said. "I'm just saying there is one." Duncan looked at the road. Ruth looked at her hands. The cart moved on through the darkening afternoon, the horse's breath coming in small white clouds, the brass case on Eliza's lap holding 11 years of proof that the world was not as orderly as it pretended to be. Edmund Harwick was arrested on the 14th of December, 1718. The magistrate's name was Aldous Crane, and he had been waiting 7 years for something he could use. The ledger gave him everything. The trial lasted 9 days. Harwick's lawyers were expensive and determined, but the ledger was in Harwick's own hand, and his own hand was very difficult to argue with. Silas Horn disappeared before the trial ended. He was never found, which Ruth considered an acceptable outcome. The alternative would have required her to testify, and she had already done enough. Duncan Mercer testified. He stood in the courthouse in Boston in a coat that was not black and not torn, and he said everything he knew in a voice that did not waver, and when it was over he walked out into the December cold a free man for the first time in 11 years. He came back to Gloucester on a Tuesday. Ruth was splitting wood when she heard Chester whinny in the barn. That particular whinny, the one that meant someone familiar. She set down the axe and walked around the side of the house and found Duncan Mercer standing in the yard with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that she had not seen there before. Uncalculating, unguarded, simply there. "You came back," she said. "I said I might." "You didn't say that." "I thought it very loudly." From inside the house, Eliza's voice. "Is that Duncan?" "I told you he'd come back, Mama. I told you." Ruth looked at this man, this scarred, sea-worn, improbable man standing in her yard in December with his hat in his hand, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. "The spare room still needs a door on it," she said. "The hinge is broken." "I can fix a hinge," Duncan said. "I know you can fix a hinge. That's why I mentioned it." He looked at her. She looked at him. The winter light was thin and pale, and the harbor was somewhere behind the trees, going about its cold and indifferent business, and everything that had happened on a muddy road in a rainstorm 2 months ago had led, through violence and cold water and a great deal of mud, to this exact moment in this exact yard. Duncan Mercer put his hat back on his head and picked up the axe she'd left beside the wood pile. "I'll finish the wood," he said. "Then I'll look at the hinge." Ruth didn't argue. She went inside to tell Eliza, who already knew.